You can't succeed without resilience. Resilience is a double-edged sword. What are the X factors that separate the very best leaders? I put 3 things at the top of the list. The ability to simplify complexity. Who are you as a leader? And
what truly separates a good CEO from a world-class one? Well, in today's episode, I sit down with the one and only Adam Bryant, author of the CEO Test and the Leap to Leader, a man who has interviewed over 1,000 top leaders to uncover the real traits behind exceptional leadership. So we explore the power of simplifying complexity and navigating the paradoxes that make or break CEOs today. So whether you're leading now or preparing for a top seat, this episode is packed with insights that will challenge how you think about leadership and yourself. I know that you write about leadership identity. What's your take about that shift that is required at the top?
spend a lot of quiet time with themselves and be very clear about your why. Don't try and figure everything out yourself.
Why people should connect with you, Adam? What's a good reason for people to connect with you?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm always...
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the World Class Leaders. Today, I'm really excited. I know that what you're thinking right now. Every single time I say I'm excited. Yes, because I have an amazing guest with me, and Adam is clearly one of them. So I've been looking for this conversation for a while. So we have today with us Adam Bryant. Adam is joined as the ExCo Group, a senior leadership development executive mentoring firm, as managing director in 2017, after 30 years careers in journalism, including 18 years at the New York Times. In addition to his many roles at the Times as a reporter and editor, he created a weekly, and I'm sure you are aware of, Corners Office column, and interviewed more than 500 CEOs and other leaders over a decade. He has written, by the way, 4 books based on the themes that emerged from Corner Office and from his current widely followed interview series on LinkedIn with board directors, CEOs, and chief human resource officers. His 2 most recent books, The CEO Test, Master the Challenges That Make or Break All Leaders, and The Leap to Leaders, How Ambitious Managers Make the Jump to Leadership, were published by Harvard Business Review Press. Adam is finally a senior advisor to HR 50, part of the War 50, and the Reuben Mark Initiative for Organizational Character and Leadership at Columbia University. And again, we said, if you are a LinkedIn user, I'm sure you have seen Adam around. So Adam, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Great. Thank you for the invitation, Andrea.
By the way, it's so common. We really shared a number of things, even if we met only recently. No, we share the CEO world, meaning we are so much connected with CEOs, either on coaching, either on consulting, advising, listen to them, interview them. So this conversation, I'm sure, will be super insightful because collectively, I'm sure we can share some insights that might be useful for you in whatever role you have right now. Either you are already a CEO or you have the ambitions to become a CEO, or maybe you're just interested in what happens, at the top of the table. But Adam, before we start, I think I heard I read somewhere but please correct me if I'm wrong, that you said that your father was a journalist. And for a while, he didn't want you, or you didn't want to follow the path. By the way, it's quite common, father, and dad and son, right? So if that is true, what changed your mind? Not just to become a journalist, but, to take a kind of a path that then you took.
I caught the journalism bug when I was in college. I joined the college newspaper, and it just seemed like, I like to learn new things. I like to talk to people and learn from them and learn their wisdom. And so just that experience of being a reporter on a college newspaper really caught the bug, and thought, boy, it'd be great to have a career doing this, and had a dream in my early 20s that I'd love to get to the New York Times before I turned 30, which I did when I was 29 years old. It's been a wonderful journey, and just being able to have really 2 full careers, 30 years as a journalist, 18 years at the New York Times, and now in this new chapter doing consulting and working with leaders on the universal challenges of leadership.
But it's true that at the beginning, you didn't really want to follow the same path.
Yeah, it was sort of like, typical teenager. It's like, I'm not going to do what my parents do, right?
Very familiar. It resonates. My dad was a banker, so clearly that was not a path for me, which is very different than the path I took. So it's not surprising. Most importantly, so if we go back a second, but because it's relevant for what you do right now, to your early days in journalism, you took a quite interesting a different path than traditional path, of reporters or asking or interviewing people about business challenges, strategy, profit numbers, which is the traditional way of reporting about business, right? You took a very different path. You decided to talk about leadership. But I'm curious, what really first drew you to the kind of storytelling and leadership themes that now define your career? There is something, maybe it's an event, maybe it's somebody that you interview, you talk to, that trigger your interest in leadership versus the traditional conventional business questions.
If I go all the way back, so I played a lot of sports when I was a kid. And I remember even from a young age being interested in leadership and the different styles that coaches had. I mean, I played sports, and if I was watching football, I was always curious, like, this coach on that side of the field is like yelling and waving his arms, and the other one's just, standing there stoically. It's like, so I was always curious about different leadership styles. And then when I got into journalism, I was a business reporter for many years, interviewed a lot of CEOs, asking them the traditional questions about their businesses and their strategies and the competitive landscape. I just have this innate interest in people. When I'm with people, I really want to understand their backstories. And so I found when I was interviewing CEOs that just kept coming back to me. Like, I wanted to set aside the usual business questions and just say, how did you become you? And like, how did you learn to do this job? And how do you do this job? And just that kept coming back to me. And finally, I sort of rolled all that up into a very simple idea, a simple question, which is, what if I sat down with CEOs to interview them and never asked them a single question about their companies? And that was the genesis of this weekly corner office series I created in the New York Times and ran for a decade, a departure from how CEOs have been traditionally interviewed, because most CEOs are interviewed as strategists, right? Not really as leaders. And so really wanted to sort of open up the conversation about the universal challenges of leadership, share their insights and wisdom on how they do it, but also help people. Like, I'm curious, like, why do people want these jobs, right? There's
Yes.
obviously material rewards, but there's a lot of trade-offs, there's a lot of sacrifices. And so I'm always curious about, like, where does their drive and ambition come from?
And that is one of the, I'm going to take a note on many things we have in common. So this interest about what is behind it all and what's a sacrifice, what does it mean to be CEO is clearly a common interest that we have. And by the way, I'm sure that many CEOs, at least especially at that time, I'm sure they challenge a little bit that sort of kind of a different level conversation they used to have it, because I'm sure that they were thinking, you're not going to have me any question about my company, my business, how it's going, etc.
Yes, a couple of things though. One, after I started the series, I mean, people were kind of clear what they were signing up for, because like it was a written Q&A, so people could see before that. And I was very explicit up front, just saying, I'm not going to ask you any question. But so there was that. But the other thing that I found is that, I think a lot of the CEOs actually were really welcoming this different conversation, because one of the insights I've had is, I think to be a CEO, you probably find yourself giving the same version of maybe 2 or 3 different speeches all day long, right? You're meeting with clients and investors and employees. And when you answer questions, whether from investors or even most of the business press, it's like, where's growth come from? And to just be able to, talk about leadership and the lessons they've learned. I found so many of them were like delighted to not only have that conversation, but to be asked about that. Because when you're CEO, you set the strategy, maybe you revisit the strategy once a quarter, maybe once a month, but your 24/7 job is leading, right? It's sort of like, professional sports coaches now. People always just ask them, like, how are you going to win? And why did you lose the last game? Nobody ever asks coaches, like, what's your leadership philosophy and where did that come from? But that's what they live every day. So again, to me, there was this whole area that people really didn't explore. And the CEOs themselves seemed really happy to and wanted to have that conversation.
And I think now the situation has changed. Now it's much more common for people and for CEOs to have this sort of a different level of conversation than what they used to have before. But at the time, I'm sure that was a fresh air, something new. Now, by the way, I just want to tell you this interesting story. 90% of CEOs I interview here, because I'm very clear upfront in terms of what kind of conversation we like to have, they sign for it. But sometimes I still see some CEOs, they say, sorry, I don't sign for this. You're not going to ask me questions about my business, my company, etc. So no, thank you, which is fine. But I think it's how that flipped. If we get more now in terms of what you found, because that's what really the audience is interested about. If I'm not mistaken, you have interviewed at least or more than 1,000 CEOs and senior leaders. So it's very significant, right? Very significant number. Now, I know it's difficult to put that together, and you've wrote a book, and we'll come back to the books, but what patterns have much more surprised you about what separates average type of leaders to world-class leaders, which is also the name of the podcast? So I'm interested to hear, what are the patterns that you were quite surprised to hear?
I think a lot, just as you do. What are the X factors that separate the very best leaders, the world class business leaders? Because every senior leader has to have, 100 competencies, right? Strategic thinker and all that other stuff. And so I'm always curious, like, what are the differentiators? And I always come back to, for me, just after all, working with leaders and interviewing leaders, I put three things at the top of the list. So the first one is the ability to simplify complexity. And just because the world is getting more complicated and disruptive, it's moving faster, industries are being disrupted, there's a lot going on in the company. I think it's such a crucial leadership moment for when the CEO is standing on the stage at an all hands meeting or an investor conference to be able to say in very simple terms, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to get there, this is when we're going to get there. And these are the 3 or 4 things we're going to do to achieve our goal. And these are the 3 or 4 challenges we have to overcome. And the ability to do that, I find, is a rare skill, but it's such a crucial skill for leadership, because so much of, a leader's job, especially CEOs, is to create alignment in the company, right? Like there's a lot of polarization in the world. And just to be able to say, no, at work, this is our goal. This is where we're going, why we're going there, how we're going to get there. So to me, that's number one. Number two, I think this whole idea of being an authentic leader has become so much more important in the last 4 years. People expect that of their leaders, right? So it's not just what you do, but like, who are you as a leader? And so I always, when I'm working with leaders, I think it's really important that leaders be able to say, again, let's go back to that all hands meeting, right? What if somebody in that audience were to raise their hand and say to the CEO, who are you as a leader? Right? Maybe nobody will ever ask that question, but how would you answer it? I think the best leaders, basically say, thank you for asking that question. I want to tell you about 3 values that are really important to me. And I want to tell you not just what the values are, but I want to tell you the stories behind them so that you understand where they come from. And finally, I want you to understand how those values show up in my leadership style day to day. And to be able to say that, it's self-awareness, it's transparency, it's vulnerability, it's humanity, so that people would say, okay, I kind of get you as a human being more than just the CEO. So that's number 2, this idea of authenticity and being clear about your values as a leader. And the third thing, Andrea, is category of that I see of being comfortable in the paradoxes of leadership. Because this, like the hardest thing about leadership is all the different balancing acts, right? The contradictions, the paradoxes. Are you supposed to create a sense of urgency or be patient, right? Are you supposed to be a really good listener, but like you have to be decisive, right? You want to be compassionate. That's really important for leaders. But you also have to hold people accountable. And I just think if you take everything that's hard about leadership, you can create a sense of like, these are the balancing acts. And not everybody's comfortable in those balancing acts, right? Like some people just want to say, no, this is my leadership style. But like everything is contextual, everything is situational. And with each of those balancing acts, you have to know what the right leadership approach is for the minute. So those are the 3 things that I keep coming back to that really set the best leaders apart these days.
Fantastic sharing. Because, by the way, these are evergreen. I mean, the 3 things that you said, they're timeless. I mean, they don't just work in a very specific era or cycle in organization. Really evergreen. And they're all in service of what is happening, of course, right now, because they're timeless. If I look at the 3 things that you shared, very interesting to hear something from you, especially in terms of number 2 and 3. I'll tell you what I mean with that. Because Number two is a big thing, especially at the CEO level. I mean, authenticity is a big thing in leadership. So, and I work with leaders where authenticity is missing, and you can feel it even when you're trying
Sure.
to bring it up, or you can see how some people they reject it. It's so difficult for some leaders to be authentic at work, so they ended up to wearing a mask and stay with the flow and let things go and keeping their own thinking and about everything, because they might say, oh, I'm better than you, what's the point, you know I know how things needs to get done, etc. So this level of authenticity and meeting their mistakes and failures and meeting the have gaps, etc., it's so hard, although it's such an incredible principle. What else can you tell me and tell the audience in terms of how to drive the level of authenticity? What you experience? Maybe some story or lessons that have been shared with you that might give you some, they might give us some insights in terms of how to make that real for people.
To me, it really does come the most important of that formula. Because I always think, let's just for context, Andre, like I always believe that when you are going to talk about leadership, there's only three currencies of leadership, right? Now, you and I know, like in leadership, there's a lot of leadership theories, there's a lot of platitudes, there's a lot of people who just say leadership is about one thing. I kind of reject all those. And I think the most meaningful way to talk about leadership, the three currencies are like insights and lessons, the stories behind them, and then the sort of practical ways to implement those lessons. So again, you think about like, I learned this. This is the lesson I learned. Now I'm going to tell you the story how I learned that. And then thirdly, because of that, this is how that shows up in my leadership style day to day. And so I've got so many examples from CEOs where it felt like a very organic, authentic story about how they learn to lead. So it's just one example. There's CEO, one of our coaches now, but I met him when I was doing my New York Times series. And he told me this story. He said, when I was a young leader, I kept getting the same feedback, which is that I was very good at holding people accountable, but I was very bad at giving them direction, right? So think about that. Hold people accountable, but not good at giving direction. And what he told me, he said, that sounds like a jerk. So he was basically acknowledging, like, I was a jerk when, and he said, so because of that, first of all, I understand the importance of like clarity and of direction. But he said, because of that moment, his leadership style and what he insists everybody on this leadership team has to do this. They have to go to people who work for them, right? Their direct reports, and say to them, how can I help you be more effective? What can I do to help you be better at your job? So, and that feels like a very organic hold to me, right? Like just this idea of like, I had this moment where I realized I was a jerk when I was a young leader. And because of that, I shifted my leadership style. And anybody who works for me who's a leader has to do this as well. And so to me, it's like you hear the story from a guy, it's like, okay, I kind of understand you, right? I appreciate the vulnerability. You acknowledge that you were a jerk when you were younger. A lot of young leaders are, but this is what you did because of that. So that to me is a great example. I'll share one other quick one. CEO I interviewed, he said, a black CEO. So when I was younger, I didn't necessarily, we all know how few black CEOs there are, and certainly in the United States, but he said that people saw some things in me when I was younger, and they really believed in me and helped me. And he said, because of that, I developed this personal philosophy of always just getting better, always striving to improve. And he picked this very specific number of getting 15% better every year. And so part of his leadership philosophy is that with his teams, he says, we need to get 15% better every year. Now, you can say, like, what's with the 15% number, right? It's very specific, hard to measure, of course, but it's just this mindset, this philosophy of like, we always have to be pushing ourselves to get better. And so he tied it to his own experience, but also made a pretty good case for why it's important to be an effective leader.
If we move to the third point, the paradox of dealing with ambiguity. So it's really dancing. I call it the dancing, you call it balancing. It's dancing in the moment and able to pivot from one place to another. Sometimes there are contradictory views or perspective or positioning, but they're needing that time. The typical risk and consequence of that, people get confused. They're not clear where they need to go, where they need to stand, because the CEO is not always clear or is not able to articulate why the change of positioning and dancing from one place to another is required. Right now, I definitely feel that is what most of CEOs are dealing with, is this level of ambiguity and dealing with all the external forces they are applying to their board. Do you have a story or lesson, something in your mind that will demonstrate perfectly, or they can tell us a little bit more about how some of the people that you have interviewed, they learn how to deal with the level of ambiguity, so living in the paradox?
Of all the different paradoxes, I find, even if you went through the game of like, well, what are the most difficult ones and most common ones? I think the toughest thing for leaders right now, they're all tough, but to me, the toughest one is being able to balance having the courage to make decisions, right? Because not a lot of, with everything going on, you really have to have the courage to make, because a lot of leaders don't, right? While at the same time, also questioning your own assumptions behind those decisions, right? So it's having the courage to make the decision, but also the humility and self-awareness and self-reflection to always be asking yourself, is this the right decision? I'm making that decision based on these following assumptions. Are those assumptions still true, right? What would have to go well for me to be right? What would have to be true for me to be wrong? And as I'm saying this, I'm sure you know a lot of leaders who tend to over-index on one side or the other, right? Some people are super courageous about making decisions, but they never question themselves. And maybe they should, right?
Yes.
And some people question themselves so much that they actually can't make a decision because they want too much. They want all the information and they overanalyze. So you think about that, right? And then I interviewed a CEO named Wendell Weeks, who's the CEO of Corning. And he has this great framework that he uses personally, but also as his company, because he's been in that CEO role for more than 20 years, right? He's grown the company. And I asked him when I interviewed him, it's like, how do you keep scaling yourself, right? Like, how do you keep reinventing yourself as a leader? And so his mantra in the company, he uses something he calls the AAA feedback loop, right? 3 A's. It's an acronym, and it stands for the first A is awareness. The second A is acceptance. And the third one is action, right? And so you think about that, and like history is filled with companies that became aware of some new trend or technology that was going to be disruptive, right? The problem they got into was when they waited too long to accept it, right? They were sort of dismissing it before they actually did something, and then it was too late. And to me, it's such a brilliant framework because it explains how companies, it kind of explains how we operate as individuals too, right? Like you become aware
Yes.
of something, but then you go through this long period of being dismissive. It's like, oh, that's not a thing. And like, how long does it take you to accept it before you act on it? And in my journalism career, I lived through this experience because the New York Times print paper is the gold standard. Along comes the internet, along comes, Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. And there was a very long time that the New York Times kept dismissing it. They didn't accept it. This is a
Yes.
real change to the business. I share that example as a great way. It's like, okay, that's the paradox. So how do you think through that? And I just love the practicality of that AAA framework.
As I always say, without awareness, there is no choice for people. So if people now become aware about whatever is happening around them, then it's difficult to make any choice. And that also applies to decision making. So great example. If we transition, Adam, to trades, you said already something about, you mentioned courage. I'm sure there is more. So if we look through the lens of trades, attitudes, mindset, what emerged from this conversation? What are the things that really stand out in terms of very high performance CEOs, in terms of how they're showing up? What's their way of thinking?
As I mentioned earlier, Andrea, I'm always curious, why people want these jobs. They are, the CEO job is getting harder every day. Leadership is getting harder every day. And nobody ever feels sorry for CEOs, right? They make a lot of money and all that. But the jobs require so many trade-offs and sacrifices. There's so much pressure. It's 24/7. And so I'm always curious, where does this person's drive and ambition come from? Help me understand why they want these jobs. And so, in some ways, I feel like I've been conducting this social science experiment over the last 15 years, trying, and understanding their backstories. Like, why do people want these jobs? And so identified to me like a handful of categories that help explain where their drive and ambition comes from for these jobs, right? So I kind of see four buckets. I know this couldn't be peer reviewed. This is not quantifiable data, it's qualitative data. But the first category, and it's the biggest category by far, is adversity. They faced a lot of adversity early in their life, right? And it could have been financial adversity, hardship. I heard a lot of stories about people who, father passed at a young age.
Yes.
Suddenly, maybe the family didn't have life insurance policy for him. And so suddenly, like, there's all this kind of financial stress. And I heard a lot of leaders tell me, said, like, I never wanted to feel that again. And I wanted all the people in my life, my family, I don't want anybody to ever feel what I did. So that sort of explains why they have that extra gear. CEOs have been very open with me, like they might have alcoholic parents, even abusive parents. And so I think there's this, not to get too like,
No, but it resonates 100% with the people I worked or I interviewed, 100%.
the three other categories, like, one is some version of kind of the immigrant story where the person was the first in their family to do X, Y, and Z, right? Whether it's go to college or do this. Leadership is about being comfortable, being uncomfortable, right? And I think when you grow up and you're always the first in your family to do something, to forge a new path, you at some point you get really comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And then leadership is just a natural outgrowth of that. So that's another category. I think I've met a lot of CEOs who just seem to like hit the parent jackpot. They had great parents, often with different influences. One was an entrepreneur, one was a psychologist, one was an engineer, the other was an artist. So there's this kind of like great blending of skills and traits. And then the final category, and I'd love to hear if all these line up for you, but I've had some CEOs who just seem to have like just so much energy. It's just part of their natural makeup and wiring, and business just becomes like a focus for that energy because they got to put it somewhere. So I don't know if that pattern sort of lines up with what you've seen in all your work.
It does. And I would add maybe one thing too, at least from me, especially when I start to distinguish, I would say, average or good CEOs to world class, high performing. That's what we're referring to, right? One thing I would say from my view is one other thing that I notice is their interest to leave a legacy behind them. Because not all the CEOs have that sort of a mentality or interest to leave something behind. And I know it's some of the things normally you develop a little bit later on in your career. Maybe it's not your first pass as CEO, maybe it's on the second or third pass. But sometimes I notice even the first pass CEOs, they're already leading and creating the vision for the future. There's some sort of legacy impact for future generation. And I'm always very attracted by these leaders because they have something different than others, because they see their visionary, of course, the level of ambition, which I think is what you are pointing to, even if we call it energy, but they have the level of drive, ambition, energy, and motivation to leave something behind, which has to be extraordinary.
Yeah.
I really work on interview people. They said, I'm here for something extraordinary. And whenever I catch myself on doing something ordinary, I feel like there is a big gap in my own identity or who I am and what I want to do. So that is a great sharing. I especially like the way that you connected the dots with adversity, because until today, I notice all the time, but I wasn't able to connect the dots. It's a common recurring pattern. I'm with you. The last two CEOs that I interviewed, by the way, here, the CEO of Greif and for example, but also the CEO of Railco, they both started sharing how they started, which is ridiculous if you think about the career they made. So adversity played a huge role in terms of turning something. And also other CEOs, they love the comeback story. They love to demonstrate they can create something different for themselves, which is really connected to the adversity. Another interesting question I have in mind for you, it's about failing. We discussed about authenticity, but if we look through the lens of risk of failing, which is top of mind for many leaders, And nowadays, I feel, at least my personal experience, and welcome your view, is there is an increasing number of CEO. They're starting to feel much more stressed and the pressure of not failing, not necessarily winning or doing something extraordinary, but just not failing, because there is so much risk and stake at the game, right? Their reputation, their finance, their family, whatever, whatever is the implication. So I'm interested and curious to hear from you. You interview people that have succeeded, fantastic. And the people they fail along the way. What are some early red flags the CEOs might not necessarily see that might lead to a potential failure later, either in the way how they lead, the way they think, the way how they operate? It is something that came up in your conversation with leaders.
Part of it, especially when you move into that CEO role, and again, I'm telling you things that you already know, but it is such an overwhelmingly massive jump to go from like a chief operating officer where your focus is more internal to be the CEO where you're dealing with all the external stakeholders. And it's not that it requires a whole different set of skills, but everything gets magnified. It's so much more about that communication style and stakeholder management, connecting like just the with your board, right? Like a lot of CEOs don't understand how much time,
Which is most of their time, unfortunately.
it's a huge amount. You tell a CEO, it's like, up to 20% of your time is going to be managing your own board. It's like, what are you talking about?
Most of the CEOs I talk to is around 40 to 50% of their time right now with the board.
Just this idea of like, creating that simplifying complexity on all the things that matter to a company in terms of the strategy, like all the things, the mission, the vision, like why we're here, what does winning look like, how are we going to beat our competitors, just to be able to crystallize that so that there is clarity within the company and alignment, while at the same time sort of keeping your eyes on all the craziness in the world and how's that going to affect our business model.
Yeah.
Managing all your stakeholders, right? It's again, like on paper, it's kind of an impossible job. And so I think a lot of CEOs don't necessarily recognize just all the things that has to happen. I think one of the biggest ways that CEOs can get in trouble is not recognizing that they may not be getting good information. Like one of the contradictions of the CEO job is as CEO, you have more lines of communication in your company than anybody else, right? At the same time, all those lines of communication, almost all of them are compromised, right? Because people don't necessarily want to be honest with the boss, right? Oh no, everything's going great, boss. And by the way, you look great, right? Like everybody comes to the CEO with an agenda. And I've heard a lot of stories from CEOs where they had these incredible, powerful moments where they realized that it's like, I don't really know what's going on in the company. And so they take much more overt steps to really set up kind of like a listening infrastructure. And I don't mean just one-on-one or in small group sessions, but like literally creating like an architecture, an infrastructure to find out what's going on in the company. One quick example. So a guy named Kevin Scherer, former CEO of Amgen, I wrote the book, The CEO Test, with him. He shared this story. They had a crisis at Amgen, and he sort of realized that he was part of the problem, that he didn't really pick up on the signals. So from that point on, he was very deliberate about, finding out what people thought. And as one of the things he did, so in the yearly survey of employees that they would send out to all their workers, he would put at the end of that survey, simple question, what do you think of the job that Kevin is doing? And he would have an open field where people could write in their comments anonymously or sign their name, because he wanted that feedback. And he would joke, he said, I would gather all those and, read them at night with an adult beverage in my hand. But because, there's probably some tough feedback, but realizing that like you have to find out what the signals are rather than the noise.
The element of communication, by the way, to me is big, is huge. And I think is one of the major issues that CEOs are facing is about communication, is getting the right getting the right information. They are unfiltered, unbiased, they're neutral, and they can do something about it. And unfortunately, what you were pointing to, meaning they are not, unfortunately, mostly in most of the circumstances, they lead them to trust less people. So that's decrease their level of trust and unfortunately reinforce what a CEO shouldn't do. So working in a bubble, meaning because when you start to not feeling trust around you and you trust only few people, you ended up to separate yourself from the company. So it's like a vicious cycle that get created unintentionally because communication is not in place. So creating an open and transparent conversation and channel with people is massive. And also, the reality is CEOs cannot be all over the place all the time. Although they might love doing it, because there are some CEOs that just loving doing roadshow and going around. But the reality is that's not possible. To be fair, it's something worth considering that in my personal experience, unfortunately, some of the CEOs they have the tendency or they build the behavior of spending too much time in the office, isolated in what is the corner office, and losing the traction and losing the real communication and conversation with people. That's why I'm a big fan of what I call the frontline CEOs. CEOs that are able to spend most of the time in the field, but not like the talk shop, right? Not the I want to demonstrate I'm here. It's really having that conversation that you are pointing to, Adam, right?
Yeah. And you're exactly right. And it takes a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of emotional energy. I'm an introvert. Like you've got to be, you got to have a lot of stamina, but also a lot of energy
Yes.
for those interactions.
Yes.
Because when you are walking the shop floor, like people can tell if you're engaged or not. Like when you say, like, how are you doing? Tell me about your job. I really want to hear. Like that requires a lot of emotional energy and it's got to be authentic.
One of my clients is a declared introvert as a CEO and is leading a large organization. And, and behind the scene, he shared something that is quite private. I mean, the executive team knows, and I think it's important that they know about being an introvert. But I was struck when he said, "You have no idea what does it mean for an introvert being a CEO. You have no idea because we have all this perception that CEOs are extrovert and they are, love going around in conferences, events, going around people. But for some of it, actually, I don't know whether there's any stat, by the way. They talk about the ratio between one and the other. But think about all the stress and pressure and all the challenges that comes with the title and the role. Then for somebody that is not really used to spend time with people, it's fascinating how people they need to transform themselves as well to lead with a role that requires unfortunately a lot of relation connection, which to me is a good segue for the last big conversation I have for you, Adam, is about identity. So my new book is about leadership identity, meaning what does it mean leading at the top? And what do you need to do when you feel like something is wrong? You're losing connection with yourself. You're not clear where you're going, so purpose is missing, legacy is missing, and you feel like nothing is working, even maybe for this sort of identity crisis that sometimes happen. What's your experience, Ada? Because I know that you write about leadership identity. What's your take about that shift that is required at the top?
If you're hitting a rough patch and questioning why you're doing what you're doing, or
Well, especially no, I think it's a broader question in terms of what sort of shift is required at personal level for CEOs to lead during moment of uncertainty, ambiguity, because there is a work required for themselves. And you said before
yeah.
you talk about awareness, but what has been your experience in terms of the impact on themselves, the identity, the pure identity?
One way I think about answering that is that I always tell people when they're, if they're early in their career and they want to move into management and leadership positions, is to spend a lot of quiet time with themselves and on the simple question of like, why do you want to do this? Very clear about your why, because if you're doing it for financial rewards, it's probably not going to be worth it because these jobs do take so much, right? Like the sacrifices and trade-offs that you make in your life, it's very easy to feel like the money's not worthy. So if you're doing it for money, if you're doing it for power, like that might work. I mean, we still see lots of examples of people who lead because they're power hungry, and some of those people get promoted. But I think in this day and age that, the tolerance for power hungry bosses, it's going down a little bit, right? Like there's still too many bad bosses in the world. But if it's just for power, that's not really going to work. If you want to be a manager, if you want to be a leader, if you want to be a CEO, like your why, I think, has to be that you want to make a contribution and have an impact and help develop and coach people and do things that are going to have a broader impact. We talked about this earlier, your legacy, but just that you're looking to help, and that it's about that sort of broader mission. Because whenever you hit rough patches, whenever you hit those like dark moments, it's 11 o'clock at night, you're in your office by yourself, you got nobody to talk to, like it's just going to be you and your why that is going to get you through those tough moments. So that's what I always come back to. It's like, why do you want to do this? And because if you're not clear on that, if it's not an enduring, really powerful why, like it's going to be hard to get through those tough moments, those failures that are going to be inevitable in your career.
Yeah, and that's when you have an identity crisis, because there is a disconnection between yourself and what you do and your why. So you explain it perfectly, Adam. So I have a last question for you, Adam. I mean, we can go, forever here because we are so much passionate about the topic. But what other advice that you haven't shared yet would be worth sharing with the people in the audience right now? There are, again, either CEOs or ambitious leader that want to become a CEOs, or CEOs at the moment they're lost a little bit of their plot. There is something missing for them. Any other advice that came from all the work that you have done, of course, first as a reporter, but then also then with ExCo Group, and maybe I'm sure some of these lessons then are well captured and advised in your latest books. But there is anything that we haven't covered that is worth considering for people that are listening to you right now?
One specific point I'll add, I mean, we could talk for hours, Andrea, but I've come to appreciate with age is this word resilience, right? Which is so important, right? You can't succeed without resilience. People call it grit. They talk about just that sense of like, I'm going to get through this. The thing that I've seen in leaders and I've come to appreciate, and honestly, just in my own career, I sort of saw me falling into this trap, is that resilience is a double-edged sword, because generally people who are resilient, they've learned early on in their lives, maybe because of adversity, but they've learned early on to count on themselves and to count on themselves only. Again, whether in my personal life early on in their life, but as they're moving up into their career, like when things get hard, they sort of say, I'm going to figure this out. I'm in this dark hole, this tough spot myself, and I'm going to get out of it. And that's very often how people rise up, because they feel a tremendous amount of personal accountability and responsibility. This just like, I've got to find a way to this happen, right? So that's the way they're wired. So that's the great part of it. Where it becomes a double-edged sword is that you move into a leadership position and you get a challenge, and you just naturally, reflexively say, well, I've got to figure this out, right? I've got to protect my team. I've got to put this burden on my shoulders because that's what I do. And I got to protect my team. And that's precisely the opposite of what you need to do when you become a leader. Because when you're a leader, you need to say, hey, everybody, we've got this challenge. It's a shared challenge. I'm 100% confident we'll figure this out, but I don't know what the answer is, and I need your help. And those 4 words, I need your help, are so powerful, and people respond to that. People want to help. It's like, yes, let's figure this out as a team. It's a challenge. It's a shared challenge. And so I just like the message to leaders, don't try and figure everything out yourself, and be comfortable uttering those 4 words, I need your help, because they're incredibly powerful.
Wonderful final thoughts, Adam, which I 100% again resonate. So love it to the extent that I feel so many leaders get into the trenches and they remain operational while they don't totally appreciate the new role requires a different level of leadership. So that is different than going, become or stay as an operational leader. So Adam, thank you so much. It's been such an amazing conversation. I love it as I expected. So why people should connect with you, Adam? What's a good reason for people to connect with you, and where to go?
Yeah, best is on LinkedIn. So just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with you. You'll see me there.
Fantastic. So Adam, thank you again. Amazing conversation, and well, good luck. And if you're still interviewing other CEOs, well, I'm sure there will be new insights that will come up.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.